If you have any questions about religion at all, very likely there will be a philosophical component to the questions that you're asking.
Even if I, disagree, it's a joy to read, just to be able to see what are some of the best minds about that.
Prophets are not theologians or philosophers. Let's be very clear about that. That's the first thing.
God can see all possibilities, even if he doesn't know what will happen.
Let me assert this. No Christian can assert that Jesus has complete foreknowledge.
Doesn't that make the atonement of Jesus Christ really not important then?
Well, I'm not going to adopt that argument because that's not a logically sound statement.
How do the scriptures influence your philosophical takes and outlook on life?
I mean, I haven't yet made my free choices. How can God see something which doesn't yet exist?
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Swords and Spirits. Great to have everyone here again. Today we're joined by a very special guest. If you follow us a little on philosophy, or you know a little bit about philosophy, this episode will be a good one. If not, this might be a little more difficult to understand, but today we are joined by our friend Blake Ostler. Blake, how are you doing today?
I'm a blessed individual. It's just the truth.
Awesome. Well, today, like I said, we're going to be talking a little bit we're going to be talking to Blake about a few different things. The first thing we're going to talk a little bit about is just philosophy, and then philosophy of religion. But before we do that, Blake, tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, some of your work, some of your books. Just for people that don't know who you are, just give us a brief summary of who you are and what you do.
Okay, well, I'm the husband of one and the father of 5. We have 17 grandchildren. That's the best part. I practiced law as a litigator and specialist in constitutional and education law, along with a number of other sub-areas for 38 years. I have taught philosophy at 3 different universities. I was adjunct at BYU part-time, and it's because I was a full-time attorney while I was doing it. And I've written the Exploring Mormon Thought series, which presently is 4 volumes. I've published more than 50 articles in professional philosophical journals. And I'd like to think that we could at least make some people interested in something that I'm very passionate about.
Well, awesome. Well, that's a great introduction. So everyone, again, this is Blake Ostler, and this is going to be a really good interview. So Blake, to start, we're going to talk a little bit about philosophy. A lot of people, you'll hear the term philosophy and they'll think something, or they may have said something to the effect in the past of, well, this is my philosophical view, or when they're talking about something, or my philosophy is. Now, I don't think that's really a great wording because I don't think a lot of people know what philosophy is. So let's start there. Blake, what is philosophy? What does it entail? Just give us a little bit of background of what philosophy is so we can better understand it.
Philosophy is the curiosity that everybody had before the education system smacked it out of them. It's the passion for learning and asking questions. Philosophy is the love of learning about any subject at all. There's no way to get beyond philosophy because every subject that can be studied, there will be a philosophy about it. And philosophy looks at the assumptions, the ground that exists between all disciplines. And so I'll give you the best introduction into what philosophy is. I had a religion class from Joseph F. McConkie at BYU. And he had a full class where he was berating the philosophies of man and how they had distorted and basically corrupted the gospel, okay? He knew I was the only philosophy major on the campus at BYU at the time. And so at the end of the lesson, he turned to me and said, "And what do you think about that, Brother Ostler?" And I said, "Well, Brother McConkie, I think that's an interesting philosophy."
But was he wrong?
Well, there's no right or wrong. The great thing about philosophy is that one studies all different perspectives, and there's not a single subject matter that is off limits. and so it is open. However, philosophy always moves forward on the principle of charity. That is, if I'm going to look at an argument or I'm going to discuss an argument, I always look at it in its strongest form. So if I'm going to discuss an argument that's made by somebody and they haven't given the strongest form, I'm going to say this isn't the strongest form of the argument they could give. Here's a stronger argument. I'm going to deal with that one because it does no good to defeat a weak argument when there's a stronger argument for whatever they're arguing for, right? So the principle of charity demands that essentially we steelman and understand fully another person's perspective, and that if we can see a way to strengthen it, we do that, because the rule of charity is that we're both seeking wisdom. The end goal isn't to be right or wrong. The end goal is to be enlightened, to actually see how one moves forward in particular issues. I'll give you the issue that I've had since I was in grade school, actually. How is it possible that we're free and morally responsible if everything we do is the result of chemicals in the brain? Okay? And how is our consciousness related to the brain? Because no part of the brain is conscious. Certainly the molecules and the cells and the sub communities of cells in brains aren't conscious. And so how does consciousness arise out of a brain? And in some way we would have to say the consciousness is dependent on a brain, because if I hit you hard on the head, you're going to lose consciousness, right? So these are just basic questions about, how is it that I'm even aware that I'm conscious at all? How's it that I'm aware of being aware? And so that's the kind of very basic question that philosophy will ask. Or what are the assumptions I'm making in even asking that question? And is that a well-formed question? So, there's a philosophy, there will be a meta-philosophy about everything. And, it's like you can study ethics. What is the good? What is the good life? What are my moral obligations, if any? And then we have the study of meta-ethics. What is the grounding and source of ethics? Okay. So philosophy is as broad as the human mind can reach. It is as deep as the human mind can delve, and it is as interesting as a person is interesting. Only bored people don't get excited about philosophy.
Yeah, I put it that only a lot of nerdy people, if you understand, if you keep up with this conversation, I will say, if you keep up with the conversation we have today, you are a nerd. I don't think there's any getting around that.
Or you could just be a human being with a functioning mind who has naturally comes up with questions because the education system hasn't quite destroyed you yet. So,
Just kind of to summarize what was just talked about, it's more of a goal, not necessarily a right or wrong with philosophy, just the goal to be enlightened, right?
yeah, I mean, for every position, there will be people who are equally bright or more intelligent who hold a different view, right? And for every argument, there will be counter arguments. It's the realization that we're, I mean, we adopt also cognitive humility. One cannot study philosophy, the history of thought, and so forth without being humbled greatly, because there are so many different perspectives by very bright people that one is forced to admit and assess their own thinking in a way that, you know what, maybe I'm wrong about that, or maybe they have a better argument here, and my question is, can I make an equally strong rebuttal, or is there something here I should adopt and put into the way that I have been seeing things? um, and so, it's really just openness to others, the way they view the world, their ideas. And really accomplished philosophers are a real joy to read. Usually they're versed in logic and, formal logic. And the way that they argue for a particular position is a thing of genius very often. So,
I love that. I think that's also spot on too. I mean, for my philosophy of religion class, we were talking a little bit about there's a paper called No Good Reason, okay, and it's an atheistic response specifically to the problem of suffering.
hmm
Less of the problem, but more specific, highlighting the problem of suffering. And the author, she she even concedes a point that has been debated for like the last 200 years about that specifically the argument that she refers to, that atheists should either not necessarily complete, well, yeah, I would say get rid of, is specifically, I believe, called the logical argument, for atheism. And I believe, she uses another argument called the evidential argument,
Right.
that she feels is a lot better. And even if I, disagree, it's a joy to read, just to be able to see what are some of the best minds about that. So, which and I think that's very, very beneficial with when you're reading different philosophers, and
Well,
like
in
you were
case
saying,
you're wondering, but I've got it. Let me respond a bit to the logical problem of evil. I think Alvin Plantinga is credited with giving the best response to the logical problem of evil, based upon a free will defense. But there are always questions about, did Plantinga adopt a legitimate view of free will in order to defeat the logical problem of evil? Is what he's proposing actually logically possible, or is it incoherent in and on its own? I give a new logical argument in exploring Mormon thought, showing that there's a logical problem of evil for those who believe in an omnipotent God who creates out of nothing.
gotcha. Yeah, and for specifically, that's referring to creation ex nihilo, which a lot of evangelicals will posit that God created the universe out of nothing. So, and
Not just evangelicals, it's literally every other Christian group besides LDS, those
mhm,
who accept process thought and that kind of thing. So it's the the traditional Christianity has accepted creation out of nothing.
mhm, yeah. And we'll dive more into that on a later episode too. Yeah, we'll dive more into that on a later episode too. Today specifically, Blake, we're gonna have you talk a little bit. So you talked a little bit about what philosophy is. I want to dive now into a specific area within philosophy, that's philosophy of religion. And we've talked, I think, a few aspects that are used, like the problem of evil, for example, which is an element in philosophy of religion. But just for people that don't really know what that is, what can you just explain to us, for our listeners, what is philosophy of religion? How can we best understand it?
Well, philosophy of religion is simply the exploration of issues that arise in every aspect of religious belief. So, it would ask, is there a God? If there is a God, what is God like? Are the kinds of explanations that have been given by God logically coherent? Are they plausible? Is there a reason to take them seriously? Should one accept the Bible as disclosing God? Um, if God has certain attributes, what are they? Are the assertions regarding those attributes logically coherent? I'd say largely in the tradition they're not. Okay. Um, and we've already talked a little bit. I don't think that there are any good logical proofs for God's existence. And the God that they would tend to prove is either not really available to Mormons, but even more seriously, it's not a God anybody would want to worship. Um, because they don't really deliver a personal being that could possibly love. They deliver an impersonal being. And um, the bottom line with the philosophy of religion is that virtually anything you can come up with that concerns religion is within the scope of philosophy of religion. So one can ask, for instance, what does it mean existentially to believe in Christianity? What are the implications for me as a person, ethically, aesthetically, as aesthetic studies, the philosophy of what beauty is and what the standards are for determining whether something's beautiful, um, my ethical obligations with respect to those kinds of issues, metaphysics that discusses the most ultimate realities that would underlie the question. So there are all these areas of philosophy, and when one studies philosophy in profundus, profoundly, um, the they all come together. They're all part of the same kind of a question, and they all have to be addressed in order to adequately address an issue. So the philosophy of religion is very broad, and if you have any questions about religion at all, very likely there will be a philosophical component to the questions that you're asking.
Awesome. That was great. I think that, yeah, that was very helpful. And we'll be putting, for everyone listening, we'll be putting some links and some information if you're interested in diving a little bit more into philosophy of religion or just philosophy in general, as well as Blake's information, or specifically Blake's books. We'll be we'll be mentioning those in our link description. But I think that's a great intro. Now I want to dive go a little bit further into again another element of philosophy of religion, because there's different views, and I talked a little bit about this with you earlier, Blake, but today's episode specifically is going to highlight divine foreknowledge. And there are different forms of foreknowledge. There's what I call the classical theist, or the closed theist foreknowledge. There is the middle foreknowledge, and then there's also open theistic foreknowledge. I believe there's one more. I don't remember the name of it.
Mutualism. Actually, so let me kind of break it down.
Sure.
There are very different views about God's foreknowledge. One is what I'll call simple foreknowledge. God knows the future because he's already seen the future, right? It's like a vision before him. The problem with simple foreknowledge is that once God has seen what the future will be, there's nothing he can do about it. It's not within his power to change what he's seen will be. So God literally cannot use his knowledge for his providential interaction with the world. It's useless to him. Okay. And it also assumes that there's a future that already exists to be seen in some sense, obviously, right? There's, as you've already alluded, middle knowledge. Middle knowledge is the knowledge in between what's natural knowledge. So God knows all logical truths, okay? And God knows all truths that are possible. And in between what's possible and what is given in terms of logic, which can't be differently, so what can't be different is called natural knowledge. His knowledge about possibilities obviously isn't enough to tell him what is truth. It simply tells him what's possibly true. And so middle knowledge is what God knows would happen given any circumstances he would create. So it adopts what philosophers call a subjunctive conditional statement. If Adam is created in the specific condition of the Garden of Eden, Adam will freely eat the apple. Okay? The question is whether their freedom is compatible with that kind of assertion. I argue that it is not. And the question is middle knowledge even possible? I argue that it is not, because middle knowledge, so for instance, instead of Adam, let's replace Adam's name with the person who was never created. We'll call him Krog, just because I like the name. So Krog, if he were placed in the circumstances of the Garden of Eden, would freely eat the apple. Well, we would have to ask, what is it that makes it true that Adam would eat this apple? Can't be Krog, he doesn't exist. Can't be God, because if he brings it about, it's not free. And it can't be a logical truth, because if it's logically necessary that Krog eat the apple, he's not free. So what is it that makes this future conditional statement true? And this is called the grounding argument, and I don't think the grounding argument has ever been adequately answered. So I don't think middle knowledge is possible. There's also what we can call eternal knowledge, and that is that the past, present, and future are laid out before God like a person who's high on a mountain. He looks down on a road and he can see everything that hasn't passed by him yet, everything that's now passing by him, and everything that's already passed by him because it's up the road. And so that's a visual take on timeless knowledge. Now the notion is that all of reality exists in a single moment, a single instant, in which God grasps everything past, present, and future. And there are also different versions of eternal knowledge. So for instance, if God is simply seeing what's occurring on the road, it has the same problems as simple foreknowledge. He sees the truth, but he can't do anything about it to change it, because his knowledge is dependent on what already exists. God can't bring about what he sees with respect to free acts, because then they wouldn't be free. And the question is, how is there something that exists outside of time that hasn't yet occurred? I mean, I haven't yet made my free choices. How can God see something which doesn't yet exist? Well, it's supposed to exist in timeless eternity. This is a very, very large subject. I've written no less than 3 chapters in my book on it. And so I think the issues related to timeless knowledge, you know, I can only give the barest of outlines here. And then there is what is known as open theistic knowledge. This is the notion. All that really exists is what exists now. The past has existed, and to the extent God was there to witness it and experience it, he knows all about it. He has a perfect memory. But there are 2 versions of open theism. One is that there simply is no truth about what will occur in the future, because truth needs to be grounded in something, and what it would be grounded in doesn't exist yet to ground it. And so there is no reality. There is no truth about what would occur in the future. The second is that there may be a future that exists in some sense, but God in time can't access it. It's impossible to know. For instance, it's impossible to know what would occur in the future for a number of reasons, and that is if a person is truly free, and I'll just give you the argument. This is the bare bones argument. It's a simple argument. Assume that in the year 2000, God saw that I would buy gelato at a particular gelateria, and I would do it freely, okay? Is that a coherent statement? Now, I'm asking, he saw what I would do in 2015 and 2000. Am I free to do it? And the answer is no, because in order for me to be free, I have to be able to do otherwise. I have to be able to do other than I actually do. I have to be able to not buy gelato. Or the fact that I bought pistachio or fragola, strawberry gelato, okay? I have to be free to change my mind or do different things if I'm free. But if God's seen that I already purchased strawberry gelato in 2000, I would have to be able to have power to change the past in order to do other than what God saw I would do or what God knew I would do in some way, right? And so how is it possible that I would have that power, because I don't have power to change the past? It's over and done with. I'm stuck with what actually has been seen in 2000. And so I don't have the power that would be necessary for me to have free will if God has foreknowledge. Now that assumes a temporal reality, but it doesn't get better if we assume that God is outside of time. If God is outside of time, he is immutable in a strong sense. That is, there's no way that God could be anything other than what he just is. There's no change. A change requires a distinction in temporal moments. A change means I'm one thing at a time t1, and then I'm a different thing at time t2. So it requires temporal succession in 2 different things, right? Well, but if God is outside of time and there is no temporal succession for God, how could it possibly be? Because there's no before and after, but God is simply stuck with the way things are. He's immutable. I would have to be able to change what the immutable God knows outside of time in order to have the power to exercise free will. But nobody has that kind of power. And so there's a very strong argument that the kinds of knowledge that are generally posited in the tradition, and by tradition I mean Muslim, the Judeo and Christian traditions, the kind of knowledge that's posited in those traditions is just logically incoherent in and of itself, and it's not logically consistent with the existence of genuine free will. Now, there are different ways to approach that. One is to redefine free will. Say that when I tell you I don't need to be able to do other than I actually do, to be free, all I really need to do is intend to do what I do. I don't have to be able to do other than what I do to be free. But there are all kinds of counterexamples to show. Let's take a 2-year-old who intends to wet his pants, but he can't do anything other than wet his pants. He doesn't have the power not to. And would we say that it's a matter of free will that the 2-year-old wets his pants? No, he can't do otherwise. It's just what he does, or she does, I suppose. And so, they're very involved arguments about different notions of free will. And if one alters the notion of free will, the argument for the incompatibility of foreknowledge and free will loses much of its force. But then the notion of free will gets watered down to the point that it's not really free will at all. And so I think there's a very strong argument that foreknowledge and free will are not logically compatible.
We'll take a pause just right there, because I'm sure a lot of people are like, what the frick did he just say? But to kind of sum down a little bit, so there's a few concepts. So there's specifically is free will, or a lot of Saints oftentimes we use the term or agency. A lot of Christians will use the term agency, and what Blake specifically, and Blake, feel free to correct me if I'm misstepping at all, but that specifically, if God knows the future, okay, and the future, basically, if God knows the specific decisions that you are going to make in the future, therefore therefore in a sense your agency or your free will will not exist, and because it is seems to be deterministic. Blake, is that a, I know it's kind of very dumbed down, but is that a good kind of summary of kind of what you were saying in this specific argument that you were kind of making?
Well, I'm not going to adopt that argument because that's not a logically sound statement. The
Sure,
fact
sure.
is, we could lack freedom because of determinism, but determinism could exist even if God doesn't have foreknowledge, and we still wouldn't be free. So it's not really a matter of determinism. Determinism, especially causal determinism, is also incompatible with genuine free will. The best way to conceive of it is what I call the necessity of the past. Once, if God knows something infallibly in the past, we don't have power to change it, and it's that simple.
Okay, awesome. Okay, Tori, you had a question?
Yeah, I have several. Mostly,
Good.
at least in the LDS Church, Revelation, prophecy, and all that, that's obviously all very big. And the fact that God has no foreknowledge in open theism, at least for me, it kind of throws that into question as well. So, is that a problem with open theism? Is it, say, better to assume that God can see all possibilities, even if he doesn't know what will happen? How do you kind of reconcile the two of them?
Well, I do assert that God knows all possibilities because of his cognitive excellence. But that, of course, wouldn't be enough for foreknowledge. Knowing that something's possible doesn't mean that you know what's going to happen. Okay, I I know it's possible that next year the Kansas City Chiefs will win the Super Bowl again. But knowing that it's possible is a far cry from knowing that it's going to happen. The reality is now there are extended scriptural arguments and questions about whether God has foreknowledge. Okay, and I would say that there are scriptures that would support the notion that God has foreknowledge. Though I think if we look at them carefully, we can see that they don't assume the kind of foreknowledge necessary for the actual knowledge of the future. For instance, when God sees what's going to happen in the future, He's giving a vision of His plan and what He intends to bring about. The fact that God has power to bring about a future and to bring about His plan doesn't mean that He has to have knowledge about what's going to happen. He only has to know what His power is and that He has power to bring about what will happen in the future. That would be involved in a plan of salvation. We have scriptures, for instance, that say that most misquote the scripture and say that all things past, present, and future are before God. That's in DNC 130, but that's not what the scripture says. It says all things past, present, and future for the benefit of the angels is present before God. Again, it's His plan that is what is present before God because it shows how He intends to bless those that are His angels, not a vision of, from outside of time. But let's acknowledge this. First of all, prophets are not theologians or philosophers. Let's be very clear about that. That's the first thing. Second, prophets and apostles don't need to be philosophers. And three, it's better if they're not philosophers. Okay? So the reality is that prophets and apostles have a very different purpose and role than a philosopher would have. A philosopher is exploring questions. A prophet is answering them to an extent. Every prophet exists within a particular time and place and has a particular perspective. Every prophet that we have in the Old and New Testament speaks from the background of the culture in which they exist, given the language that they can speak, assuming the cultural background and terms that they live in, and we don't find a single scripture in which anyone is writing as a philosopher. We see people who are writing from the perspective of, a witness of Christ, or somebody who wants to argue that this is how Christianity fits in with Judaism, in the case of Paul. but they are not doing philosophy in a strict sense. They're doing philosophy generally in the sense that philosophy includes everything, okay? But they're not philosophers, and they shouldn't be. If prophets become philosophers, they're going to screw everything up. Trust me about this, okay? We don't want them to get into the analytic details of all the doctrines. When we say that, for instance, we say Jesus is the Son of God, and it's like, okay, but he was already the Son of God before he was born of Mary. So how is he a son? Oh well, there's a mother in heaven. What, you mean the mother in heaven got pregnant and delivered a spirit even though she's a resurrected body? How's that possible? And so, do we really want prophets asking those kinds of questions? No, we want them to simply testify. You are a son and daughter of God, just like Jesus was a son of God. And what we mean is that God is a father and loves you as a father. And to take it beyond that, we're going to have to get into philosophy, okay? So the Bible is what I call pre-critical. The Book of Mormon, all the scriptures are what I call pre-critical. They're not doing analysis. They're not doing, they're not making logical arguments with the logical rules of inference and understanding the logical fallacies. They're not doing logic. They're testifying. They're not doing history. When they write a testimony of Jesus and who he was about the mighty deeds he did, they're not trying to do that within the canons that apply to higher education when a person is doing history. If we impose on them those kinds of standards, they fail miserably. I mean, they don't, and that's just because they're not doing it. It's like saying a person putting out a fire fails miserably at being a chemist. Who cares? Okay. They're doing something very different. And so the scriptures are simply not addressing this in a way that would address the fine-grained, detailed kinds of arguments that are addressed in philosophy. And we shouldn't expect them to deliver those kinds of exacting definitions and analytic precision that we find in the philosophical discussions. I think it's dishonest to say that they do. A lot of evangelicals will assert they do, but that's just not honest.
Awesome, and that was great. Thanks, Blake. And then we're gonna ask you more questions later towards after this next part. But for this next part, Blake, I want you talk a bit about what open theism is, why it seems to be why it seems to be not just possible but probable. But I want you specifically because oftentimes you'll hear in my discussion with people that are typically more of a classical or closed theist, and they will oftentimes give me their best case. So I want you, Blake, to give your best case on why you would consider open theism the best argument in regard to God's foreknowledge, or just the best argument specifically for God, for God's knowledge, his omniscience in general. And for more detail, people can go look at your books. But Blake, let's start with why is the argument, or your specific argument of open theism, why would you consider that the best argument or one of the best arguments for God's omniscience?
Well, there are several pillars to open theism. The first is that genuine free will is not consistent with foreknowledge, absolute foreknowledge that asserts that God knows everything that will happen in the future. It's a logical claim, but I think it's demonstrable, and I think it's by far and away the best position. I've argued for it, and unless you can show me how a person has power to change the past, that's a starting point. The second is that it conforms to our immediate experience. There is a now. The future doesn't exist yet. And there's no reality about the future because we're creators. And until we create the future in our interaction with it, there's no truth or reality about it. Okay? There may be tendencies, and there may be some things that are genuinely inevitable in the future given the natural laws that exist and the causes that now obtain. So, for instance, if you have a tumor growing in your body, it is certain that you will die. We can say that to certain people. We can't operate. It's too late. And so we know the future. We can't tell you the exact moment, but we know what's going to happen. In fact, I will predict right now we will all die. The bottom line is that there are certain things that are inevitable about the future. I don't know when or how, and if I did know when or how, I wouldn't go to where it was supposed to happen. So there's this interesting story by Richard Taylor about a guy named Osmo who finds a book in a library, and every single sentence is about his life, and it says in detail everything that's happened to him, and he reads it, and everything that he's ever done in his life is totally accurate up till the present moment. And then he turns the page and it tells him what's going to happen tomorrow, and then the next day, the day after that. Well, of course, he's going to fast forward and read to the end, right? He wants to know how and where he dies. So he's just not going to go there at that time. He'll thwart the book. But as it turns out, there's a specific day in which he's supposed to die, and he gets on a plane, and he's supposed to die on a plane that's going to Minnesota. But the plane is actually going to Laramie, Wyoming. But it turns out in mid-course, the pilot comes on and says, we've got to divert to Minnesota. And so he rushes to the pilot's cabin and makes a big ruckus to make sure that they can't land in Minnesota. But in doing so, he causes a crash while the plane is on its way to Minnesota. And so he brings about the very prophecy he was trying to avoid. That's what we would call fatalism. There's nothing you can do about it. There are a number of other reasons, and that is that let's just take two prophecies that would indicate that the future is open. It was virtually accepted in early Christianity that the second coming would happen within the generation. In Matthew 24:34, Mark 13:30, and Luke 21:32, Jesus says, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place, okay? And so automatically what he's saying is the people who are standing in this generation are still going to be here. And it is a certainty that the folks writing the New Testament believe that Jesus was going to return within their lifetime. We have several books in the New Testament that attest to that. Yeah, and it's called the imminent parousia, okay? And it didn't happen. He didn't return in power within that generation. There was also a prophecy that Joseph Smith received that the temple was going to be built in Independence, Missouri in this generation. Didn't happen, okay? And so we have these prophecies, and, in fact, you can go right now. If you look at the Come Follow Me manuals that were given to the church, they explain that prophecies are all conditional. There's actually a statement in the book of Jeremiah that all prophecies are conditional. They have an if in them. So, for instance, if God says, and this, for instance, take what happened in Nineveh. God goes and pulls Jonah out of the belly of a well so he can go to Nineveh to carry his message that Nineveh is going to be destroyed. And so he tells the people, the Ninevites, you're all going to be destroyed. But they did a strange thing. They repented. And they averted destruction. And the interesting thing is he's actually upset with God that the prophecy didn't come about. Okay? So we have these kinds of prophecies. Now, there are others where it's like, okay, well, but what about when Christ tells Peter that he's going to deny him thrice in the coming night? And then it happens exactly as stated. And so there are other indications, I would think. Now, I can give you an explanation, I believe, that is consistent with God not having foreknowledge about Peter denying him thrice. But these are the kind of scriptures that are on the other side that tend to state, well, God does in fact have foreknowledge. But let me assert this. No Christian can assert that Jesus has complete foreknowledge because he doesn't know the date of the second coming. Only the Father does. And so asserting that Jesus must have all foreknowledge is simply inconsistent with Scripture because there's something he doesn't know about the future. That's the date when he returns. So it's explicit in the New Testament that Jesus, in his mortality, does not have foreknowledge, at least not absolute foreknowledge. And so, well, we get these indications, and it's like, well, what about Judas? He explains what's going to happen with Judas, and he's going to come and deny him. There's an easy response there. At the time that Jesus said that, Judas had already received 30 pieces of silver from the Jews to betray him. It had already happened. And so, we can look at these scriptures and explain them one way, try to explain them the other. My response, the real honest response is, these scriptures are not drafted with the purpose of giving us philosophical precision on this issue. They're pre-critical. None of them are thinking in the way that, that would be required to logically address this issue. And so we can deal with the scriptures. We can explain and say, well, okay, so Christ didn't return within one generation. Let's redefine what a generation means. Okay, which is what I see evangelicals doing, this in a very desperate move to try to get around this prophecy, right? But that's exactly what it is. They're not being honest with the text. They're simply trying to preserve their preconceived view of the way things have to be. They're not dealing with the text. They're imposing on the text their presumptions about what the text should say. And I would prefer not to do that. Let's read the text, and if the text says that Jesus knew that Peter was going to deny him thrice, I have explanations. Maybe he was telling him to deny him thrice because he knew Peter had to lead the church, and if he didn't, he would be taken and socked away in prison. Spencer Kimball actually suggested that one. Not my take on it. And so the bottom line is that, if when we get to scriptural issues, I think we should simply acknowledge, the scriptures are not written with philosophical precision. We shouldn't expect them to address these issues with philosophical precision. And let's acknowledge that every single prediction we get in the New Testament was written after the fact, which is really strange because, and here's the interesting thing. Every single Christian will tell you that Jesus' prediction in the very breath where he says that he will return in this same generation means that it would happen within that generation, because he predicted that the temple would be destroyed, and it was. His prediction came true. What they don't notice is, but when they want to talk about it happening in this generation in the same breath that he will return, oh no, that doesn't mean the same thing. Yeah, it's the same word in the very same passage, but it means two different things. And so I think that's just not an honest way to deal with the scriptures. Let's read them just as they are and realize that the people writing them had different views of things.
I'd agree, Blake. And I would also just quickly add before we keep moving on a little bit, that oftentimes I think it comes from specifically the scripture of Deuteronomy 18:22, where they deem the test of a prophet. But that in and of itself is very problematic. So it's, presupposing certain ideas into the text that aren't actually there. So I think what you're saying, Blake, is just spot on, that you need to understand what do the authors mean with this, and let's dive into it. Let's dive into it when we understand the context of that, and not try to be apologists for something that it's not what it means. There's nothing wrong with being a defender of a faith, okay? But if you're putting certain interpretations, then that causes issues. And if you're a member of the church that also is using certain interpretations or certain ideas of prophecy and putting your own interpretation on it that's not in the text, that is very problematic, and you're doing just what we criticize our other Christian brothers and sisters of doing. So we need to be very careful with that. But I just quickly say that before we keep going on.
Just to kind of make it more general, since we're talking about the scriptures, specifically within open, oh my gosh, why
Open
can't I remember? Thank you. I know the name. It's just been a long day.
No problem.
But and we know that the scriptures or prophets aren't philosophers, which is really just a nice way for you to avoid being prophet, I see. But
that's never going to happen.
How do the scriptures influence your philosophical takes and outlook on life? Like, how do you use that?
If I believe that the scriptures were coherent in the sense that they all agree in one, I'm not evangelical, and I don't believe in infallibility of the scriptures, inerrancy. I don't believe that they all speak with one voice. And that is, I don't believe that Moses had the same worldview as Isaiah, and I don't believe Isaiah had anything remotely like the worldview of Peter. And I certainly don't believe that any of them had a scientific worldview like I do. Okay. They were not scientists. And so they exist within a certain culture and time, and we have to read them within that culture and time to understand them accurately. It would be like a person from the future, and they've solved all kinds of problems, and they're saying, well, yeah, I mean, these guys knew all about the plasma engine that moved at the speed of light clear back then, and if they didn't, then we'll make arguments why they should have. But the bottom line is that everybody has a horizon, right? We don't, oftentimes we can't even see the assumptions that we bring to the questions that we address. We're blind to them, and we can't escape our own skin. Getting outside of our culture and time is impossible. That's where we are. And so it's just a matter of cognitive humility. We have to recognize there's not only a lot we don't know, there's a lot we can't know. And so that's a part of what it is to be human. And in philosophy, we say, okay, what are the limits of human knowledge? And is it reasonable for us to address these issues given those limits? And that's a question that constantly has to be in the background. And what we always have to leave as a possibility is, you know what, maybe I'm wrong. Possibility, right? And so I don't want to get dogmatic. I just want to say I've looked at this issue carefully, and I believe that this is by far and away the best position to take. I've looked at it from all angles, and obviously I've written a lot about it. I've read everything I can find about it, but there may be somebody in the future who comes up with a great reason why foreknowledge and free will can be compatible that I just haven't considered. Maybe it's there somewhere in the future. It hasn't happened yet, but maybe somebody will do that someday. I'm doubtful because I believe that they're logically incoherent, and I believe that's been demonstrated. But who knows?
Awesome. Okay, let's. All right. Great explanation, Blake. Let's dive a little bit. And great question, Tori. Let's go back into a little bit. So you were talking about specifically things like prophecy in regard to like scripture and how prophets are not theologians or philosophers and shouldn't be. And that the nature of prophecy is. You could explain a little bit about that. Let's expand more a little on that. Go back in there to continue your best case for this idea.
Well, as I said, it comports with the nature of reality that we actually encounter. The truth is that the future is opaque, and that's because what exists is now. And now, let's put this in the context of relativity theory. I'm going to stretch this a little bit. In relativity theory, there is no universal now for all observers in different inertial perspectives. That's a mouthful, okay? But the reality is that time can move faster for one person in one inertial frame of reference compared to another. And so some of the kinds of assumptions that we make in common language about what is now are not going to withstand scrutiny given special relativity theory, all right? But there are easy ways to dial that back to show that there is still a before and after. There is still something that is in the absolute future given every causal frame of reference, okay? So open theism is the common sense view based on our experience, and given that without free will, we wouldn't have moral accountability, okay? And that's because to be morally responsible, I have to be able to do other than what I do. As Kant would argue, ought implies can. If we say that somebody shouldn't have robbed the store, we logically imply that they could have refrained from robbing the store. Because if they couldn't have, we simply say they were acting under compulsion and they're not free. And so free will seems to us to require alternatives in the way that I've argued. And if there are alternatives, there can't just be one possible future. Okay? And what that means is that if there's not just one possible future, God can't know as actual what is only possible, because that's not the truth or reality about it. What God knows is truth. And so for God to be able to know what is true, it can't be the case that he knows the future to be something that it isn't. And that requires that God is open. Now, I could give you a list of scriptures as long as my arm that would support open theism. I could give you probably an equally long list suggesting that God has foreknowledge of some sort or another. And I just don't believe the scriptures are consistent on this issue because they're not really addressing it. But by far and away, the best view to take in terms of the reality that we confront, the way we experience it, the nature of our commitment to ethical responsibility, the kinds of free will that are required, the best view is that God has limited foreknowledge of the future. That's not to say he's completely clueless, because he knows what his plan is. He knows all possibilities. And he's like a master chess player, okay? If a master chess player is playing a novice, he may not know all the moves that the novice is going to make in the chess game. What he does know is eventually he's going to win the game, okay? God is similar. He knows all possible moves, and he knows that whatever move is made, he can bring it about that his plan is realized. He knows that there's no possibility that would make it so that he doesn't realize his purposes and plan. So he still has providential control. He can bring about his purposes. So we're not giving up the purposes and control that God has with respect to carrying out his plan. And the bottom line is that God is interacting with us in a way that respects us as persons. One of the bedrocks in Mormon thought, in fact, is free agency, as we might say, or free will. It's what mostly distinguishes us from our Calvinistic and other Protestant evangelicals who insist that God has, he actually, and this is, I mean, think about this, he actually predestines some to go to hell. And if he doesn't predestine them, he could save them and leaves them out of his grace to go to hell. I don't know how anyone concludes that a God who could save everyone out of love and refuses to do so is still a good being. And that's the central problem, obviously, with Calvinism, right? Well, with open theism, God honors our choices. He's working with us to bring about a reality. It's also the best answer to the problem of evil, by the way. If God knows without fail what the future is going to be, then why did he create those of whom the scriptures say it would be better that they had not been created? It's inconsistent to assert, I'm going to create a person knowing with complete foreknowledge that they will go to hell for eternity and that their lives are worthless and that they're going to wreak havoc and bring about all kinds of evil. But I'm creating them anyway because I like people who wreak havoc. So God can't, if God is a good being, he can't have that kind of foreknowledge and be creating persons he knows are going to go to hell. And why does he create the devil? I've asked this question and, they always, well, I don't know. And they think it's funny by just answering, well, I don't know. That's not an adequate answer. The answer is he wouldn't create the devil, knowing the kind of hell and havoc that the devil would create. What he would create are people, he would create somebody more like the devil in the book of Job. In the book of Job, the devil is not eternal opposition to God. He is a prosecutor, and that's what Satan means, or Shatan means in Hebrew. It means prosecutor. He is the person who is brought to cross-examine our lives to make sure that we can't get off trying to fool ourselves into thinking that we really are good or worthy when our lives don't manifest it, okay? So the Shatan in the book of Job is actually a gift. And so the bottom line that we're facing here is that open theism solves the greatest problems in theology with respect to foreknowledge, free will, and it, in my view, it conforms best with what the scriptures actually show us. Take what I consider to be the hardest to explain in Scripture, and I'll explain it very easily. We have the Book of Mormon, and Nephi sees a vision of the future, okay? What's very interesting is that up to the time of Joseph Smith, the prophecy is very precise, it's detailed, and it's very historically accurate. But once we get to Joseph Smith's day, it gets really, really vague afterward, okay? And so the bottom line is that what is being presented there is being actualized, as I say, by knowledge of what's actually happened, with the future only a plan that God has about how things will happen because he'll bring it about in his power, not because he knows how it will come about through his foreknowledge. So, that's the way I would approach that.
So I have a quick question then, in regard to that, because you're specifically you were talking about limited knowledge or limited foreknowledge. So a question I have that I wrote down specifically is does that affect God's specifically in theism? There are a few terms that are important to understand. The first is that God is omnipresent, God is also omnipotent, God has omniscience, and that God is all good. So in your view of, or in the view of limited foreknowledge, does that, would you say that that affects God's omnipotence, omnipresence, um, his omniscience? And if so, does that make God less than the greatest conceivable being in the world or in the universe?
Well, I wouldn't adopt the notion of God as the greatest conceivable being. That was created by Anselm. I think the very notion of a greatest conceivable being is incoherent if it's meant to mean that God is the absolute upper limit of what can be. If you're playing golf, the absolute upper limit is a game of 18. But if I ask what is the greatest number of possible home runs that can be hit in a baseball game, do you know what the number is? There isn't one. It's infinite. Okay? God's knowledge is more like a baseball game than the game of golf. And so, when it comes to the greatest possible being, there is no such thing as a greatest possible being because no matter how great God is, he can be greater. This is actually an argument that's been used in philosophy to challenge the notion of a greatest conceivable being. There are ways to redefine conceivable being. I use the term a maximal being. That is, so if God is the greatest conceivable being, it's a great making property to be happy. It's also a great making property to be compassionate. Can a God who is truly maximally compassionate be maximally happy, knowing the kind of evil and pain and what we do to each other on this earth? Isn't he pained at what we do and that we don't follow him? Every time a child is murdered, every time a child is raped, don't you imagine that he weeps? And yet, he's supposed to be the happiest person in the universe. And in a sense, he is because everything is taken within the context of the fullness of his own life. But he weeps with us. And so we have what I call the problem of inconsistent attributes to define what a greatest conceivable being is. And so I would challenge the notion of a greatest conceivable being and suggest that unless it's very, very carefully reworked and redefined, it's incoherent. Okay? Every single one of the attributes you've mentioned need to be very, very carefully defined and reworked. So, for instance, omnipotence. Well, if God's all good, can he do something evil? I can. I have the power to do that, so it's logically possible. So if we define omnipotence as the ability to do anything logically possible, God can do something evil. But the tradition is almost uniformly held God doesn't have power to do anything evil, so he's less powerful than I am. So you see, unless we very carefully work with these attributes and define them very carefully, we're going to run into a logical mess fast. So I say that God has maximal knowledge, and I redefine it to say he knows all that it's possible to know. That's what omniscience is. It just happens to not be possible to know the future free acts of persons with certainty.
Would you say the same thing with the other types of knowledge? Omniscience, all that's possible to know. As far as like God being all powerful, like omnipotent, would you also say that God is powerful in all that is possible?
Well, I give a very careful definition of omnipotence in my book. God has all the power that's possible for a person having his attributes. So, for instance, God can't do anything that's inconsistent with the kind of being that he is, right? And he doesn't have to be able to change the past. God can't make it so that a person who killed somebody in the past could go back and unkill them. Okay? He doesn't have the power to change the past, which means rather than defining God's power in relation to ultimate power, we have to ask, well, what's the nature of the past? Because whatever God's power is, it has to be consistent. And I use the term compossible. It has to be possible, logically consistent with what's occurred in the past. So it's not everything logically possible. It's logically possible in the past that Lincoln never delivered the Gettysburg Address. That's a logical possibility, but God cannot now make it the case that Lincoln never delivered the Gettysburg Address because it just happens to be true that he did. Okay? And so we have to redefine omnipotence. Omnipresence, what do you mean by omnipresence? God's not physically present everywhere. And yet God is a physical being in LDS thought, but we don't assert he's physically present everywhere. We do assert, however, the influence of his spirit is present everywhere, right? And so I would redefine it saying that it is everywhere that God's influence is able to act, okay? And his influence with respect to free creatures isn't coercive power, it's persuasive power. Okay, so God can't consistently bring about my free acts. If he did, they wouldn't be free, they would be his acts, they wouldn't be mine. And so we have to ask, well, what are the nature of the creatures that exist in relation to God's power? So you can see we have to be very careful in how we think about what God's attributes are. And merely throwing out, well, God is omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, that doesn't really tell us much.
I think that's spot on, especially defining terms is crucial in this kind of conversation, not just in philosophy, but just if we're going to understand what we're talking about, and rather than talking past each other too, it's super important that we understand that. So I love that. Is there anything else specifically in regard to open theism that you want to continue to make your case for?
Well, simply that it would make life rather pointless if everything we were going to do were already a reality, right? I mean, why even send us here to test us to see if we will keep the commandments? If God knows we already are going to keep whatever commandments we keep, what's the point? There's no test, there's no reality about, I mean, he doesn't have to see anything, he already knows. And moreover, there wouldn't really be anything for us to prove. He could just look and say, well, this is what you're going to do. And I'd say, well, don't send me down there. Just give me whatever reward I'm actually going to get. And so it makes life rather pointless if God has that kind of foreknowledge.
Well, I think that's a great view and a good argument for your case. And if anyone disagrees specifically with Blake's view, I mean, you're free to make your case, but just make sure it's logically sound. And make sure I'd highly recommend anyone that's confused, because there are a lot of big words that we use. Some people may not exactly know what they mean. For example, omnipresent, omniscient. Okay, we kind of talked a little bit about what those things mean, but things like possible. Okay, if you're confused a little bit, again, we will. I promise we will link basic philosophy understanding or basic philosophy papers or books in our description, so you're not completely lost of what the heck does this mean. But and also for additional insight, because there's so much we can do in a 90 to 2 hour form, 90 minute to 2 hour form. But I highly recommend, and we will link them below, Blake's books. Blake's books will dive much more into these things, as well as some of the other philosophers that we've talked about. So we're gonna transition here a little bit and specifically ask questions, or maybe give a little bit of pushback, start stillman objections that may be given specifically to you, Blake. And then I know some of these you've addressed in your book, but for those that haven't read it, it might be good just to talk a little bit about them. So, and me and Tori will just kind of piggyback back and forth each time, and I'll start, and then Tori, you can just go after me after Blake answers. So the first question I have is, if hard theistic determinism is true, God only seeing a single timeline that will come to fruition, will that not technically deny God himself free will?
Of course.
Okay. Awesome. Self-explanatory, or pretty straightforward. Okay, Tori?
Talk about a leading question, jeez.
I'm an attorney, so you can cross-examine me and use leading questions. I give you permission.
Let's go. Daniel, go again. I just need a second.
Okay. All right. Okay. So the next question we have is, so to what extent are non-covenant moral agents blameworthy of breaking commandments that they have not agreed to?
It depends. I mean, Paul says that we have the law written on our hearts, right? So does Deuteronomy, by the way. And we talk about the nature of the light of Christ. And so there is an assumption that we all have this basic moral conscience that tells us what is right or wrong to a certain extent. Now, if we've covenanted to do something, then we've taken on additional obligations that don't exist without that covenant. Let me give you a really, really, really tough one. It is not moral for a person to have sexual relations with more than one person than their spouse. But there may be conditions under which God gives a command, okay? Take another spouse. You've covenanted to obey me. And I'm asking you to trust me that this is in the best interest and I have a purpose for this, okay? And because we trust God, we believe that he's the most trustworthy person in the universe. He knows a lot more about what's good for us than we do. It would be moral, and not merely moral, but potentially morally obligatory for us to do what God has commanded us to do. So covenants can change. If there is no such covenant, it may be morally permissible, but not morally required for us to follow God's commands. Okay? So what that means is I might not have a duty to do something that if I haven't covenanted to do it. So once we've entered into a covenant, we've given our word that we will do what God commands us to do. We have an obligation to keep our word. If we don't keep our word, the entire universe is going to take notice that our word doesn't mean anything to us, and it won't trust us.
Awesome. Great. That was a great answer. Okay. Tori, do you have a question or want me to keep going?
Yeah, I've got one.
Okay.
Just speaking about commandments from God and everything, and we have the law of Christ in our hearts, yada yada yada. What do you do, or can one reconcile, I guess, in terms of philosophy, when God's commands or his alleged commands contradict your own personal or inner morality, if that makes any sense?
Well, first of all, your own personal inner morality, I would say, is a charade. That's what we would call intuitionism. And there are a lot of problems with intuitionism. First of all, people's intuitions differ. And what makes you think your intuitions are reliable when people differ with you on their intuitions? And what is the moral basis for saying that your intuitions give you anything like a moral obligation at all? So, I mean, it's not really the case that these kind of subjective ethical laws and rules just are not like that. It's like, it's okay for me to slaughter people, but not for you because you believe it's wrong, but I don't. So I'm not bound by what you believe is wrong. I'm only bound by what I believe is wrong. So it's okay for me to slaughter people. Well, that's just not what morality is like. It's not what ethics is like at all. So I would say the beginning from the premise that I have my own personal morality is a non-starter. And so the kind of intuitionism that is being assumed in the question is something that I would reject out of hand. Does that help at all?
Yeah, that makes sense. Essentially, your own intuition is faulty.
Well, it can be. Maybe your intuitions are good intuitions, but how would you know?
Right.
If that's the case, would just to demand what someone would say, would that be? Is that the same as? So someone may say, well, Blake, that sounds awfully similar to divine command theory, where God's morality trumps all. One, that might just be a misunderstanding of what divine command theory is, but someone might pose that objection. What would you say to that?
Well, rejecting intuitionism very clearly does not require that one accept divine command theory. There may be other bases for what is right and wrong besides what God commands, and it doesn't depend on your intuitions. So, for instance, there actually is a truth about whether it's right or wrong to steal, right? There is such a rule, and it exists independently of what you think about it. But it doesn't depend on God. Are you telling me that killing little babies just for the fun of it would be right in some world if God didn't command us not to do it? I mean, no, that's wrong no matter what world we exist in, even if there were no God. So saying that I reject intuitionism does not somehow adopt divine command theory. And I reject divine command theory simply because it makes God arbitrary. It makes what is good and evil and right or wrong totally arbitrary. Okay? And, God just doesn't have the right relationship to the universe and ethics in order to be the sole basis. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that if God commands something and a person has covenanted to obey God's commands, that there's not an ethical obligation to do as God commands. That's a different question. But it doesn't assume divine command theory. In other words, divine command theory is a meta-ethical theory. It's about what makes things right or wrong. It's not about the ethical question, what is right or wrong? Those are two different questions, right? So there's no way that rejecting intuitionism requires one to accept the divine command theory.
I think that's great, especially too with that specific pushback, because I think either it misunderstands either what divine command theory is, and or it also there's similarities, but it's important to differentiate between the two, and that's good. I have my own issues with divine command theory, but I think you put it very well. Tori, do you got another question?
I'm lost on what divine command theory is, so no.
Divine command theory is this. Divine command theory is the view that right or wrong are right or wrong in virtue of the fact that God commands them. So if God commands us not to do something, that makes it wrong. If he commands us to do something, it makes it right. And that's the sole basis for whether something is right or wrong. Divine command theory faces what's known as the Euthyphro objection. This is because it comes from Plato's book called the Euthyphro. Is something good because God commands it, or does God command it because it's good? If something is good because God commands it, then it's arbitrary. He could make killing little babies just for the fun of it good just by commanding it, which of course is absurd. On the other hand, if God commands it because it's good, then there's something other than God's command which makes it good. And so divine command theory is false. And so that's what divine command theory is. It faces this Euthyphro problem. It's not the only problem with divine command theory, but it is a big problem with divine command theory and a sufficient reason for rejecting it out of hand.
So, Blake, some pushback that you might get, again, for specifically the argument of divine command theory, I know we're kind of steering a little bit from open theism, but I think it still relates, would be, I believe it is in Deuteronomy 20:16 through 17, okay? This is a popular one. And obviously there is scholarship surrounding what the context was, but for the sake of this discussion, and specifically, this is might be more of an ethical question, but the idea of divine command theory. But then we have an example in the Old Testament. This just little pushback that someone might give you would be, well, God commands the genocide of the Canaanites. So if would that not be an example of divine command theory where God is dictating what is moral? Obviously, there's the scholarship surrounding that, but for this little, I would say thought experiment, is that not a good objection for this idea of of evidence of divine command theory?
It isn't. There are a lot of reasons why that's not going to work. The best reason is that the victors always write the history. And so I'm doubtful that the kind of, let's attribute it to God. I doubt that God commanded them to wipe out everything in Ai, even though he did, right? Men, women, children, all crawling things. It was pretty complete. But even if he did command it, how could it be applicable to us? I mean, he hasn't commanded us to do it. And so you're saying it's okay. Would we say it's okay if God commands them to wipe out everything in Ai? Maybe they've covenanted to do whatever God asked them to do. Are they morally obligated to do so? Pretty big theological and ethical issue. But I would say no, they have every reason to stand up and say, I'm sorry, I believe genocide's wrong even if you command it. How about that? And who's to say that? So maybe God is testing them to see if they'll stick to their moral mettle rather than follow his commands.
Awesome. Okay, so the next question I have comes from one of the groups that me and Tori are a part of, and their question specifically. So this isn't my question at all. Their question, but they said, do revelatory experiences sidestep? And I'm going to mispronounce this word. The Kantian Shemeta. I'm not exactly sure what exactly it is, but it says, do revelatory experiences sidestep Kantian Shemeta? If not, doesn't that weaken their certainty? And this person says, I think Blake has said that personal spiritual experiences are the only things he finds at all convincing when it comes to God. But it is not the case that every human experience necessitates some amount of interpretation. Blake seems to rely on the assumption being true even for revelatory spiritual experiences in his article on the Book of Mormon as an expansion. How can we rely on spiritual experiences if they don't reveal things as they are, but rather as our presupposed mental frameworks force them to be?
First of all, I've said that the kind of experiences that are testimony experiences reorient and redefine life. And so instead of having our culture being the lens for which we see reality, our experience with God becomes the lens through which we see reality, which means they're logically prior. Okay, these kinds of experiences um, are not subject to the way we interpret reality, rather, they're the basis through which we interpret reality. And that gives them a different logical status. However, if we begin to talk about our experiences, the very use of language assumes interpretation, right? So if I say to you that my revelatory experiences are self-confirming, they can be self-confirming, but if I begin to explain to you what my revelatory experiences mean, now I'm engaging in interpretation, which assumes the culture in which I live, the worldview that I have, and so forth. But that's the whole point about a testimony or revelatory experience of the kind I speak about, and that is this. Only I can have knowledge from it. I can tell you all about my spiritual experience, and it doesn't mean that you know what I know. I can use words, I can do everything I can, but you do not know anything based upon my description of my experience. This is experiential knowledge, and the only way to have it is through experience itself, right? And so, yeah, I experience as a particular person at a particular time, but because my entire life is redefined by the experience, it now becomes the interpretive framework through which I see life, rather than the interpretive framework giving meaning to my experience.
Okay, awesome. That was great. That was great. Tori, you got another question at all?
Nah, I
Okay,
I don't even know what that first question even was saying, but I think I got it. I think I got it at the end there. I think I got the
Right.
gist.
Well,
awesome.
what I think what they're saying is the Kantian categories. So what Kant says is that when we experience things, we experience them through certain logically necessary categories. And the categories are time, space, etc. Kantian categories, however, are not the kind of worldview categories that we use. So when I use the term computer, I know what I'm talking about. But if I use the term computer in 1920, I'm not sure anybody would have a clue what I was talking about, right? Because my cultural framework and experience with computers is essential to even understand what the term means. And I could describe all about it, but without them actually having encountered a computer, they're not going to have a very good idea what I'm talking about. So the Kantian view is not that, this cultural kind of knowledge that we have. It's the logically necessary conditions of experience itself. And so whoever asked the question was confusing the Kantian categories with the kinds of categories that we use to make sense of our experience through a worldview. So I'm just going to say the question was a bit confused, but I think I did the best with it I could.
All right,
Okay,
thanks.
okay. I apologize if it sounded confusing. That was just specifically typed. So,
You,
okay,
you should never ask an expert on Kant about Kant. Trust me.
that's what I've heard. My girlfriend, she studies philosophy, and she says that Kant, most people, even Kant in his, I believe, was it German, that his original language was, but Kant is so confusing that they actually study it in English because they just can't understand what he's saying in German, is my understanding.
Well, I'm pretty good in German, and Kant comes up with a lot of what we would call neologisms, ways of using words in a new way or creating words to convey what he's saying. And his German is very difficult. But I don't think he's more understandable in English than he is in German, just to put it out there.
Okay. Okay. Awesome. Another question I have, and this is in relation, another objection to open theism would be the atonement of Jesus Christ that people would put forth. Specifically, the view of, I would say that this is more of a Latter-day Saint view, because Latter-day Saints generally seem to emphasize the Garden of Gethsemane, the atonement of Jesus Christ, a little bit more than our evangelicals, Catholic, or Christianity in general. So Latter Day Saints that are more of a closed theist, classical theist, may object and say, "Well, Blake, I get what you're saying, but doesn't that kind of make a lot of the atonement null and void? Because the Savior suffered for all." Are you gonna head out, Tori? Okay,
Yeah, I gotta go. I'm sorry.
no,
Good
you're good.
segue for part two, though.
Okay, cool. Okay, we'll see you,
So,
Tori.
Bye, Tori.
All right. So, Blake, some people may object to open theism and say something to the effect of, well, doesn't that make the atonement of Jesus Christ really not important then? Because if God doesn't know the future, then has he really suffered for my own sins? Because as Elder Holland says, that the light of Jesus, or you cannot fall lower than the light of Jesus Christ shines. So the classical theist, or the classical theist of the Latter-day Saint, may say, well, if this is the case, if that's the case, then God really didn't suffer all that could ever be suffered. What would you say in response to specifically that that atonement theory? I know you have your own atonement theory. We can dive a little bit into that real quick.
First of all, the question assumes the penal substitution theory of atonement. That is, that Christ actually being punished by the Father in the garden and on the cross for the things that we did. What it means is that Christ is now appeasing an angry and vengeful Father and begging him to not be an angry, vengeful Father, right? There are a lot of reasons why the penal substitution theory is simply not acceptable. It is morally reprehensible to the maximal degree. What it means is the only person in the history of the world who didn't deserve to be punished is in fact punished for something he didn't do. And I can't imagine anything more morally reprehensible than trying to foist onto him what I deserve to have and him taking it when he doesn't deserve it. That's just, I can't imagine anything more morally reprehensible than punishing the only being who doesn't deserve punishment. I do have my own theory, and the theory does not require what I would call backward causation. So here's the real objection I think they're getting to. They're assuming in penal substitution, Christ actually suffers for what we are going to do in the future, right? So that requires that there is an extant future, and it already has causal effects on Christ in Gethsemane and on the cross so that he can suffer for what we are going to do in the future. That means there must be a future that already exists in some sense. In fact, I would assert, if what we do in the future has already had causal effects in the past, there would be no way that what we do in the future could possibly be different. But then Christ is not suffering for our sins or for what we do wrong, because there's no ethical truth to the fact that we do them. We're not free to do otherwise. And so it's already incoherent with respect to the notion that what we're doing could be a sin or wrong. In my own view, what Christ suffers is not punishment from the Father. It's not the pain of sin that is being imposed upon him by a vengeful God that he's trying to avoid having placed on us. Because the theory is that instead of us receiving the punishment when we deserve it, he receives it. And what I say is that what Christ actually experiences is the pain of entering into relationship with beings that it's painful to be in relationship with. When he enters into relationship with us, our lives become one. And the energy of our lives, he then takes and receives the energy of our lives into his life and processes it. And the scriptures say he quickens it. That is, quickening is a legal term in Old English law that means it's the first motions of life. It's when life stirs, okay? It means to give life. It means when life occurs. And so Christ gives us a new life when we enter into a relationship with him. And what the atonement is about is not really punishing somebody who deserves it by having somebody who doesn't deserve it suffer the pain. How does that forgive us? Let's say that you have a son and you have done something wrong, okay? And your son you've been accused, and he steps forward and he says, you know what? I'm the one who actually deserves to be punished, so beat me. And so let's say the police take and beat him to a pulp, okay? How does that forgive you? All that really happened is that a person who didn't deserve to be punished got punished. It doesn't mean that you're forgiven of your sins. Forgiveness requires repentance. It requires entering into Christ's life and have him enter into you. What's really happening in the Christian gospel isn't this transaction that's described in penal substitution. It is the healing of a relationship where we enter into Christ's life and he enters into us. And because Christ takes up abode in us, we become Christians. His light is now in us. His countenance, his light and his countenance are in our countenance, so that when people see us, they see Christ. So the real Christian message has nothing to do with this kind of transactional notion that is assumed in the penal substitution theory. What it has to do with is sharing life. And sharing our lives is painful because it's painful to be in a relationship with us. And he's not guilty. What he experiences is the pain of entering into a relationship with imperfect people. He doesn't experience, pain foisted upon him by someone else that he doesn't deserve. And so, and this is something that he voluntarily does. He enters into a relationship with us that he can transform us to be what he is. I don't see how punishing somebody who doesn't deserve it brings about atonement in any way. It doesn't change the person who is atoned for. If your son gets beat to a pulp for what you did, how does it change you? In fact, what it means is you get off scot-free for something you deserve and have every reason to go on sinning. So that would be the way I respond to that.
Okay, awesome. That was beautifully worded. I'm loving this. This has been a lot of fun. I think one of the last questions I specifically have specifically on the topic of open theism, because I think you've done a really great job of highlighting the best arguments and responding to some of the objections. But now, if you would be willing to, Blake, I would love for you to just briefly talk about kind of play your own critic for a second here, if you're okay with that. So where I mean, I'm only 24, okay, so and I'm still learning a lot. My service level in regard to philosophy and much less philosophy of religion is very surface level. I really enjoy it. I'm learning a lot through different professors, through peers, but I wouldn't say I would raise like the best objection, mainly just because I'm not as well read as some of these other philosophers that might bring objections. So the question that I have for you though is if you're gonna, I'm gonna have you just play your own devil's advocate for a second. What would you say for open theism would be? Do you consider the best objection to open theism? And then second, how would you respond to that objection, to that best objection?
Well, I've already given you the best scriptural objection, right? The kind of prophecies where it predicts what Peter's going to do. And I've already responded in a sense. The best objection to open theism is, well, there may be another view of free will that works that can be reconciled with foreknowledge. There have been a lot of attempts to do that, by the way, by very, very bright people. I've assessed those, and I don't believe that they work. But those are really the best kinds of arguments against open theism. And besides, I mean, if I were to really critique it, honestly, I would say I think it's brilliant, and there's nothing really that can be said against it that will hold water. How's that?
Okay, fine. That's I think that's fine. That works. I was just curious if there was a specific one, and then
Well, we've
um,
discussed those kinds of things along the way. I brought up what I thought were the best arguments against it,
sure.
and I don't mean to say that there aren't brilliant minds that hold a different view. I'm just saying I've assessed it very carefully and at length, and I've written about it at length. And from my perspective, I don't see any of them being even remotely persuasive. So maybe I'm just not the best person to ask that question. I don't know.
No, you're fine. You're fine. I mean, like I said, in regard to open theism, that's something that I think I really resonate with. And I know a lot of specifically younger Latter Day Saints, really love your Exploring Mormon Thought series. And again, we will link that to our audience below. I think one of the other questions I have, and it relates, I would say, but it might be a little bit different. Would you posit that open theism is a good argument specifically for the existence of God, or do you think it doesn't really relate because it's more dealing with God's foreknowledge?
I think open theism assumes God's existence. It doesn't prove it. However, it avoids the disproof based upon on incoherence based upon God's attributes and the incompatibility between free will and foreknowledge. So it at least makes God's existence possible. I don't, I think there are other views of God that just aren't possible because I think they're logically incoherent. That is, what's logically impossible can't be the case, okay? So, open theism is specifically a position of faith that already accepts God's existence. Now, there are different views on open theism. There are evangelical open theists who accept that God created everything out of nothing. There are what we would call panentheistic or process open theists who don't accept creation ex nihilo. They don't believe God created everything out of nothing. And of course, LDS open theists don't believe God created everything out of nothing. For an evangelical open theist, I think that open theism is less plausible. The reason for that is that when God creates people, he doesn't know what they're going to do. And yet he's creating them, literally taking one hell of a risk with them and about what could turn out. However bad things are, they could be a lot worse, okay? And God doesn't know what's happening when he creates. He doesn't know what's going to be brought about by that free person. And so I would say that evangelical open theism, that is creation ex nihilo, would infuse into the view a kind of contingency and uncertainty that may well be inconsistent with faith. For process open theists and Latter-day Saint theists, I don't think that kind of instability exists within open theism. I think you need Mormonism to fix the evangelical view of open theism.
I think this has been great, Blake. I really appreciate it. That's kind of all. I've run out of questions. Either I previously came with, or you've answered all the ones that came into my mind specifically. We will have another episode specifically, or we're hoping to have another episode where we dive more into the problem of evil. Either we'll have you come back for that, or we're hoping to get another philosopher that I was telling you about before we started recording to come on if he agrees. But to kind of wrap everything up, because I know we've dived into a lot of deep concepts that a lot of people are probably going to be, I don't understand this. And again, I highly recommend reading what we recommended, the different arguments, because these are smart people. Even if we, like for example, Blake, I know you disagree on a fundamental level with some of these specific arguments, but it's good to be aware. I would also say it is good to be aware of what the arguments are, so we can figure out what the best arguments are. But to close, Blake, I want to really give you one of the last words. If again, we've talked a lot about these different concepts, but if there's one thing that people want to get out of this, or that you would hope people get out of this in regard to everything we've talked about, if there's just a single thing or a single few things, what would those things be? If you could just make sure, if you want to emphasize a single point or a few single points that people get out of this episode.
My hope is that it motivates a great deal of curiosity to look further into the issues. An hour and a half podcast can't possibly delve into these issues adequately. Now, I have a website, blakeostler.com, BLAKEOSTLER.com. And there I also link to, we do podcasts that discuss each of the chapters in these issues in my books at length, okay? And so that may be an easier way than reading the books. The books are written for an upper level philosophy course. And I think some people find the podcast to be accessible and a much easier reach than trying to pick up the books and go through them. Though I think that, people ought to, do the strong mental lifting of taking on a subject that's not easy for them. And so, but I don't want people to come away from this saying, oh, I just got all the answers. I want them to come away with this thinking, boy, I want to study that a lot more. I want to delve into that and look into it.
Awesome. Well, Blake, thanks very much for coming on today. I think this has been very beneficial. And again, I would really, really emphasize to people who's listening, again, you may think you have some of the answers, okay? And Blake has come to his own conclusions. I would highly suggest that you do your own research to come to your own conclusions, because we're all still learning. It's important to be humble. And just with this episode, if you didn't understand everything, it's okay. We will dive more into things in the future, and then we also want to be able to provide you resources, which again we will link below. So Blake, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on, and hopefully we can have you on again and talk more at some point. Maybe on the problem of evil. But Blake, I really appreciate it. Thanks so much for coming on. Okay.
You betcha. Thank you. You take care.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching Sword and Spirit. This has been an episode with Blake Ostler, a philosopher, theologian, and we will see you all next week.